Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here, as always, is to take these huge, complex stacks of sources on topics people, well, often prefer to avoid, and really distill them into clear, essential insight. And today we are undertaking a crucial and deeply sensitive deep dive. We're exploring the challenging and, frankly, profoundly misunderstood words of compulsive sexual behavior.
It's a topic that's unfortunately shackled by just immense stigma. And because of that, individuals experiencing it often suffer in total isolation, in silence. But as you said, the stakes are just incredibly high. We're discussing patterns of behavior, whether we decide to call it sex addiction, pornography addiction, or the more clinical term, hypersexuality, that can and do systematically dismantle personal relationships. They derail careers and just crush a person's emotional well-being.
So our goal today is to cut through all of that confusion and the moral judgment that always seems to surround this issue. We want to define what the actual clinical markers are, to understand the powerful forces that drive this behavior, and, really crucially, to look at the mechanisms. I mean, from deep psychological wounds all the way to measurable neuroscience.
And the context for this whole analysis is more urgent now than it's ever been. Modern technology, ubiquitous digital media, the instant anonymous access they provide, it's all fundamentally altered the landscape. This convenience has contributed to a demonstrable escalation of these compulsive patterns, really, worldwide.
That instant, discrete access. It doesn't just lower the barrier to entry, right? It feels like it creates a perpetual feedback loop where the behavior can exist completely outside of any real-world constraints or, meaningful human context.
It facilitates a truly destructive cycle, and we have to be perfectly clear about what we're analyzing here. This deep dive is absolutely not about
judging a high libido or just enjoying sex.
Exactly. Not at all. The core issue we're discussing is uncontrolled dependence. The defining and really heartbreaking characteristic of this compulsive behavior, no matter how it manifests, is that the pursuit creates more suffering, more distress, more internal conflict than it ever provides genuine pleasure or lasting connection. The behavior itself becomes a source of profound, enduring pain.
Okay, so let's establish the formal terminology right away. Let's move beyond those colloquial and, like you said, often misleading labels. When clinicians are actually approaching this loss of control, what's the official framework?
The current formal classification that we focus on is compulsive sexual behavior disorder, or CSBD. In the diagnostic manuals, it's recognized as falling under the umbrella of behavioral addictions. It's similar in function to pathological gambling or compulsive shopping.
Yep.
And at its root, it's considered an impulse control disorder.
The moment we use that term, impulse control disorder, it really signifies a transition, doesn't it?
Right.
It's no longer about a conscious choice to do something, but about an unmanaged, overwhelming compulsion that's just overriding your intentions.
Exactly. The affected individual, they have an awareness of the cost. They recognize the negative consequences, the financial strain, the emotional distance, the damage to trust, the sheer loss of time. And yet, the thoughts and the actions that follow become uncontrollable. The need, the compulsion, it's felt as something stronger than their rational will. They feel utterly driven.
And when we talk about these entrenched patterns, there has to be a certain duration, right? Something that separates, say, a temporary period of stress coping from a persistent clinical disorder.
That's correct. To define this behavior as chronic and clinically significant, the symptoms must have persisted for a minimum of 6 months. And it's not just the duration. The behavior has to cause a significant measurable impairment across multiple domains of the person's life. Impairment in work, in relationships, in health maintenance, in their emotional stability. We are looking at a destructive, entrenched pattern, not just, a bad couple of weeks.
And the physical and digital ways this behavior shows up are so diverse, which is probably why it can be so difficult to identify. What's the scope of behaviors we're actually talking about here?
The scope is broad. It can manifest internally as excessive masturbation, where the frequency and duration start to interfere with necessary responsibilities or lead to significant physical neglect. It also includes the rampant consumption of digital explicit material, a focus that's sometimes encapsulated by that German term Pornosucht, where massive amounts of time are just consumed by seeking, viewing, and processing content.
Pornosucht, that's a really powerful term. It sort of captures that specific cultural anxiety around the addictive quality of digital consumption, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights how the digital medium itself becomes the locus of the dependence. But beyond just consumption, the behavior also includes an excessive pursuit of sexual partners, what might be casually called promiscuity, or the compulsive, intense, almost continuous engagement in cybersex, phone sex, or using sexual services. The specific activity is almost secondary to the underlying drive.
So the particular activity, whether it's viewing or seeking or engaging with someone, that might change. But the foundational theme stays fixed across all these different behaviors.
Absolutely. The defining foundational theme is that core loss of control. The individual's inability to stop, despite knowing the severe negative consequences, is what turns the sexual impulse from what should be a healthy part of life into a source of chronic stress and misery. I mean, just consider the sheer energy required, the mental effort spent engaging, the emotional effort spent hiding it, and the time spent recovering from the shame and chaos that follows. That energy just starts to consume the center stage of their entire existence.
To make this more tangible for our listeners, we should probably look at the key diagnostic markers, what you could call the 6 pillars of compulsion that clinicians use to identify this dangerous loss of control. And in clinical practice, a diagnosis generally requires what? The presence of at least 3 of these markers over that 6-month period.
Yes, this is where we move from that general feeling of being overwhelmed to the specific behavioral patterns that really signal a true dependence.
Okay, let's start with what feels like the most relentless aspect, the constant mental focus. The first pillar is intense focus and preoccupation.
This is often called Fokussierung, a term that really emphasizes the singular, often irresistible nature of the fixation. We're talking about an overwhelming, constant mental preoccupation with sexual content, specific fantasies, or the meticulous planning of the next sexual engagement. This is not a fleeting fantasy or an occasional daydream. These are thoughts that occur frequently, often dominating the person's mental landscape for hours every single day.
To make that constant preoccupation tangible,
Yeah.
is there an analogy that really helps you understand how this focus takes over the brain?
The best analogy I've encountered described it this way. It's like the pattern recognition part of your brain has been completely hijacked. It becomes hyper alert, constantly seeking out sexual cues in the environment. Innocent comments are interpreted as innuendos. External stimuli that most people would ignore are seized upon to reinforce the compulsion. This constant internal planning of when, where, and how they'll engage next, it induces this state of slight excitement and anticipation, which is that immediate dopamine hit that locks the cycle even further into place.
And that profound preoccupation naturally leads right into the second pillar, which is loss of control.
This is the practical failure of willpower. It's the inability to maintain self-imposed boundaries. The person repeatedly engages in the behavior for significantly longer than they intended. A planned 30 minutes of viewing pornography turns into 3 hours, multiple times a week. More devastatingly, they are completely unable to stick to resolutions to abstain, even for short self-imposed periods. If they promise themselves, okay, I will not engage for 5 days, they often fail on the very first or second day.
So the individual isn't just wasting time. They're experiencing these constant, intrusive thoughts that are actively hijacking their schedule and overriding their executive function.
That is the function of the loss of control. The sexual impulses interrupt other crucial activities almost daily, demanding immediate attention and causing the individual to drop tasks unexpectedly. The executive function, that part of the brain responsible for planning and resisting, is consistently overruled. When an impulse hits, the resistance is nearly non-existent. The behavior becomes almost automatic.
Which brings us to the third criterion, which speaks to the core pathology of any addiction, tolerance development or steigerung.
This is that relentless requirement for increasing intensity, frequency, or duration to achieve the desired effect. The brain just habituates to the stimulus. What once provided a satisfying hit is, well, no longer sufficient. To compensate, the individual has to seek out harder, more specialized, or more extreme content. They seek riskier, novel, or more frequent experiences, whether that means more intense role-playing, riskier cruising behavior, or increasing the frequency of paid services.
It's the biological process of desensitization, right? It's forcing them into behaviors that might be increasingly dangerous or just violate their personal boundaries.
Precisely. And this tolerance has a critical, really damaging consequence in their intimate life.
Yeah.
Functional decay. Their brain becomes so recalibrated to the high-intensity, specific stimuli of the compulsive outlet that they may find it difficult or even impossible to build or maintain arousal during partnered sexual activity. They might report feeling emotionally distant or even, bored during healthy intimacy because the neurological threshold for gratification has been artificially raised so incredibly high.
Wow. Okay, now for the fourth pillar, the presence of withdrawal symptoms, or Entzugserscheinungen. This feels like proof that the dependence is deeply rooted, even without a chemical substance.
It is. When the individual attempts to reduce or stop the activity, and this can manifest very rapidly, sometimes within hours, they experience measurable, significant psychological and sometimes even physical discomfort. The symptoms include pronounced anxiety, irritability, acute restlessness, intense cravings, difficulty concentrating, or general physical malaise like headaches or muscle tension.
And that discomfort isn't just a byproduct, is it? It serves a deliberate function in the addictive pattern.
It acts as the coercive driver, forcing repetition. This physical and emotional distress is a massive negative reinforcement. The individual is driven back to the behavior not primarily for pleasure anymore, but simply for relief from that withdrawal state. This powerfully confirms the addictive structure of the behavior, regardless of the, semantic debate over the label.
Moving to the external damage, the fifth pillar addresses the negative consequences and social conflict, or Kosten and Konflikte. This is where the private struggle becomes a public destructive force.
This criterion highlights the continuation of the behavior despite severe, undeniable life costs. We see immense damage to relationships rooted in chronic deceit, lies, and betrayal. Work or academic life suffers significantly missed deadlines, poor productivity, often compounded by engaging in the compulsive activity at work despite the risk of disciplinary action or even job loss. Financial costs mount rapidly, sometimes leading to crippling debt. Health, both mental and physical, is just neglected.
And there's a profound internal dimension to these consequences, that conflict of values.
That is often the source of the deepest suffering. The individual is engaging in behavior that fundamentally conflicts with their core ethical, moral, or religious beliefs. The result is intense, cyclical periods of guilt, debilitating shame, and self-disgust immediately following the act. It's internalized as acting against one's own true identity, knowing you are violating your own deepest moral code simply because you feel unable to stop.
And finally, we get to the sixth pillar, which describes the depth of this entrenchment. Persistence, despite necessity for change, or Beharrlichkeit, which relies on some powerful defense mechanisms.
This criterion signifies a profound sense of hopelessness. There are repeated, intense, yet ultimately failed attempts to change the behavior. These failures often lead to resignation, a feeling that stopping is impossible. And data suggests that these change efforts often fail rapidly. A relapse can occur within days or a couple of weeks, which reestablishes the old patterns, sometimes making the compulsion even stronger than it was before the attempt.
And if sustained change seems impossible, the mind develops these powerful mechanisms to protect the self from the pain of that failure.
Precisely. That leads to what is termed dissimulation, the act of concealment, minimization, and rationalization of the behavior. The individual actively lies to close relatives, minimizing the true extent of the problem, or they engage in these psychological gymnastics, justifying their actions to themselves. They might find themselves slowly changing their own moral framework, for instance, accepting increasingly extreme content, simply because internal acceptance is easier than facing the monumental, seemingly impossible task of change. This persistent inability to stop, despite the clear necessity in multiple attempts, is the ultimate hallmark of the disorder.
Okay, that systematic breakdown of the six pillars makes it so clear that this cycle is vicious and self-sustaining. But let's shift from the what to the why. If the rewards fade and the misery increases, what complex mix of factors keeps driving this relentless pursuit? We need to look at the etiology, the causes, through the lens of the individual, the medium, and the environment.
The immediate surface-level function of this behavior is overwhelmingly tied to emotion regulation, or simply coping. For the vast majority of affected individuals, the compulsive activity serves first and foremost as a desperate, powerful escape mechanism.
So the behavior is less about the inherent desire for sex and much more about the desire to escape an emotional state.
Exactly. The individual uses the powerful physical sensation, the rush of excitement, or the temporary distraction of the act to flee from underlying overwhelming emotional pain, chronic stress, profound boredom, deep loneliness, pervasive anxiety, or just crippling feelings of inadequacy. The sexual activity provides a fleeting conversion of intensely negative feelings into positive ones, or at least a temporary effective numbness to distress.
Can we detail the spectrum of emotional avoidance here? It goes way beyond just stress, doesn't it?
It does. For many, it's not just about coping with externally applied stress. It's about existential distress. The behavior can be a way to avoid taking responsibility for complex life choices, or a method of combating feelings of profound inauthenticity. Some individuals report feeling truly alive or authentic only during the high-intensity engagement of the compulsive activity. They use that powerful sensation to override a persistent sense of emotional flatness or dissociation. And this reliance on the behavior for emotional stability then leads to the complete disregard of healthier, more difficult coping mechanisms like engaging in therapy, self-care, or cultivating genuine, deep interpersonal connections.
That reliance on a quick fix brings us naturally to the deeper psychological roots, particularly the link with trauma.
There is a significant and clinically critical link between behavioral addictions, especially sexual compulsion, and unresolved psychological trauma. This includes childhood physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, or profound emotional neglect.
How does that trauma translate specifically into a compulsive sexual drive? I mean, it seems counterintuitive for a survivor to seek out the very area where they were harmed.
The mechanism is complex and tragic. For some survivors, the excessive pursuit of sex or the compulsive engagement with explicit material becomes a method of reclaiming control. It's a desperate attempt to turn a past, painful, passive experience into an active, chosen behavior. Alternatively, the behavior can function as an attempt to shed deep-seated feelings of shame, guilt, and internalized worthlessness associated with those past experiences. The momentary, overwhelming sensation can mask dissociation, that feeling of being disconnected from one's body or environment, which is a common trauma response.
So the body is essentially using the addiction to manage the memory and the emotional fallout of the trauma.
Precisely. And beyond trauma, we also identify other psychological risk factors. Chronically low self-esteem, high levels of inherent impulsivity, and the critical issue of co-occurring mental health disorders. Clinical depression and generalized anxiety disorders, for example, often coexist with CSBD. These conditions create a persistent negative emotional baseline that the individual is constantly trying to self-medicate or escape from, making the compulsive behavior the most readily accessible and, at first, effective coping strategy.
Finally, we need to address the biological role. How does the body prime an individual for this specific kind of dependence?
Biology plays an undeniable central role. Like any behavior associated with pleasure or survival eating, physical exercise, risk-taking sexual activity triggers the release of dopamine. And dopamine isn't the pleasure chemical, as it's often called. It's the wanting or seeking chemical. It registers the behavior as significant and rewarding, reinforcing the pattern and prompting repetition. This is a survival system, but in compulsion, it just goes haywire, and vulnerability is heightened by neurochemical imbalances. We see a critical interplay between dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine drives the seeking behavior, while serotonin is involved in satisfaction and impulse regulation. An imbalance can mean an overwhelming drive without the normal neurological breaks. Furthermore, hormonal factors like unusually high baseline testosterone levels can contribute by increasing the frequency and intensity of sexual impulses, making the task of control exponentially more difficult. The constant firing of this system creates a highly receptive neurological environment for dependence to flourish.
Okay, let's unpack this. This is where it gets really interesting. Taking this high-level discussion of biology and connecting the compulsive behavior directly to measurable physical and functional changes in the human brain. We have significant research focusing specifically on the neurological impact of frequently consuming highly stimulating content.
The findings offer crucial empirical support for the experience of tolerance and the loss of control that people report. Studies focusing on high consumers of pornography have revealed observable structural changes, particularly within the reward pathways.
So we're talking about genuine physical differences, the brain literally adapting to the bombardment of artificial stimuli.
Exactly. One of the most important findings relates to a critical structure deep within the brain's reward system, the striatum. Research has shown a direct, quantifiable correlation between the sheer number of hours spent weekly consuming pornography and a measurably smaller volume of gray matter in this region.
A smaller volume in the very core processing center for reward. What does that structural reduction signify?
Well, the prevailing hypothesis suggests this is a neurological adaptation known as downregulation. The brain, particularly the parts of the striatum responsible for motivation and habit formation, is facing a constant, high-intensity supply of stimulus. To cope with this super stimulus overload, the brain seeks a new equilibrium by reducing the size of the mechanism designed to process that signal. This can involve synaptic pruning or changes in cell density. In essence, the reward system is physically dialing itself back. This reduced volume is a structural marker reflecting adaptation to chronic, intense stimulation, and it solidifies the compulsive habit pathway.
So this structural change sounds like the physical basis for the tolerance mechanism we were just talking about.
It is the biological underpinning. We see this functional outcome clearly when we measure brain activity. Individuals who consume pornography more frequently exhibit a significantly reduced bold response that's blood oxygen level dependent, a measure of brain activity in their brains when exposed to sexual images, compared to those who consume rarely. They are demonstrably habituated.
So the brain is actively suppressing the response, basically telling the individual this level of stimulus is no longer enough to register as rewarding.
Precisely. And the implication for daily behavior is massive. They are driven to seek increasingly stronger, more specific, or more intense stimuli. That means more extreme content or riskier, less conventional behaviors, simply to register the same level of gratification they once felt naturally. This reduced reward sensitivity is the core neurobiological mechanism of tolerance development, a functional pattern we see mirrored across all major substance and behavioral addictions.
But the pathology isn't just seeking. It's the failure to inhibit the seeking behavior. Where does the neurological loss of control actually happen?
That brings us to the control network, specifically the functional relationship between the driven reward center, the striatum, and the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. The PFC, often called the brain's CEO, is vital for executive functions, risk assessment, impulse inhibition, and steering behavior toward long-term rational goals. Research strongly correlates high-intensity consumption with diminished functional connectivity, weaker communication between these two regions.
So the drive is stronger because of the constant dopamine reinforcement, and the brain's inhibitory system is less effective at actually applying the brakes.
That is an accurate, powerful metaphor. The weakened connectivity implies a measurable decrease in the brain's capacity to override or regulate the powerful, almost automatic drive for sexual gratification once the impulse has been triggered. If we look deeper into the PFC, specific subregions, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex involved in cognitive control, show reduced engagement. Chronic stress, coupled with the constant flooding of the reward system, can physically impair the function of the PFC over time, making rational decision-making exponentially harder. This whole pattern provides a clear neurological explanation for why attempts to quit or reduce the behavior meet with such consistent failure, reinforcing the diagnosis of a genuine impulse control disorder. #tag6. Consequences and the impact on life domains.
It's one thing to discuss neurological maps and chemical imbalances, but when we look at a person's life outside the brain scanner, what does this constant struggle mean? It means a systematic deterioration across almost every domain of existence.
We have to systematically detail the collateral damage. The consequences are wide-ranging and often devastating, creating the very environment of misery the individual was trying to escape in the first place.
Let's focus first on the emotional and mental toll.
The internal distress is intense and often chronic. Individuals suffer from crushing guilt, paralyzing shame, and profound remorse due to their inability to halt the behavior. They live in a state of high emotional volatility. The chronic stress of maintaining secrecy, the fear of exposure, and the fundamental loss of control create a constant burden that often leads to or severely exacerbates co-occurring mental health issues, most notably generalized anxiety disorders and clinical depression. The relief from the act is so temporary, but the distress is enduring and it's cumulative.
And socially, relationally, that secrecy just acts like a corrosive agent against intimacy.
Oh, absolutely. Secrecy, deceit, and repeated betrayal systematically destroy trust and genuine intimacy in all close relationships, especially with primary partners and family members. This inevitably results in intense conflict, emotional distance, and relationship breakdown. Furthermore, the constant mental preoccupation with the compulsion actively hinders the individual's ability to form deep, healthy emotional bonds. It can lead to a state of emotional relationship incapacity or beziehungsunfähigkeit. They may be physically present, but emotionally they're completely absent, focused entirely on the compulsion.
And the practical material world suffers, especially professional and financial stability.
The compulsive activities actively interfere with the ability to meet professional or academic responsibilities. We observe decreased productivity, missed deadlines, poor quality of work, frequent absences, or what's called presenteeism, where they're physically there but mentally distracted. This is often described as the narrowing of the behavioral space, Einengung des Verhaltensraums, in favor of the addiction. All hobbies, friendships, productive energy. It's all consumed by the problem. Inappropriate behavior, like consuming pornography on the job, can quickly lead to severe disciplinary action, job loss, and subsequent severe financial strain, compounded by the direct costs of the behavior itself.
And physical health consequences are so often overlooked in behavioral addictions.
They are critical. Engaging in risky or high-frequency compulsive sexual behaviors obviously increases the risk of sexually transmitted infections. But furthermore, the neglect of self-care driven by the need to hide the compulsion or just prioritizing the behaviors results in chronic sleep deprivation, fatigue, chronic pain, and poor nutrition. The compulsive pattern is really a full-body breakdown.
So in a devastating irony, the compulsive behavior acts as a negative feedback loop, generating the very stress and misery it was initially used to escape. This description of consequences really emphasizes the profound pain involved. But we have to stress that freedom from this compulsive cycle is absolutely possible. And success, as clinicians note, is less dependent on the past severity of the problem and far more on the individual's motivation and commitment to using personal resources and professional support.
Recovery is undeniably demanding, but it is attainable. The journey is often mapped through distinct stages of change that guide the individual from denial to long-term sobriety.
Walk us through those critical stages, starting with the first and I imagine often the hardest step.
The first and most vital stage is acceptance. This requires the individual to end their pervasive denial, recognize the true nature of the addiction, and cease all attempts at self-justification or minimization. This step is extremely difficult, precisely because of the intense shame and guilt accumulated over years, which makes open, honest acknowledgement feel terrifying.
Once that difficult acceptance is achieved, the groundwork has to be laid.
Stage 2 is preparation. This is the phase of firm resolution and meticulous planning. The individual must create a detailed, actionable plan, often referred to as sober contracts, that involves completely eliminating access to known triggers, building robust accountability and support systems, and securing a professional diagnosis and therapeutic resources.
And then comes the active engagement with change.
Stage 3 is action and maintenance. This involves actively utilizing diversion techniques, creating new habits, and employing healthy coping strategies to successfully navigate the initial intense withdrawal period. Then the sustained effort of maintaining long-term abstinence begins. But we have to be realistic. The challenge of resisting cravings, or cravings, is often lifelong. The memory of that powerful reward is permanently stored in the psychological memory, meaning the impulse for the fix can resurface even after years of sobriety. It requires constant vigilance.
And since relapse is a statistically common part of the journey in any addiction, how should it be managed?
Stage 4 is crucial: relapse management. Relapse must never be treated as an endpoint or a sign of utter personal failure. Instead, it has to be viewed as a normal, albeit painful, learning opportunity. The failure exposes specific weaknesses in the current treatment plan, perhaps a missing boundary, an unresolved trauma trigger, or insufficient professional support. It teaches the individual exactly what stronger resources are needed for the next, more robust attempt. It's just data for recovery.
Given the complex interplay of trauma, neurobiology, and emotional dysregulation we've detailed, professional help seems almost indispensable for navigating these stages.
It is virtually indispensable. Trying to overcome this behavior alone drastically lowers the chances of long-term success. Professional guidance increases the likelihood of breaking the cycle, and the therapeutic approaches are highly targeted. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is foundational. It focuses on identifying and replacing destructive thought patterns and faulty belief systems that drive the compulsive behavior. Trauma therapy, like EMDR or other specialized modalities, is vital for addressing the deep root causes, helping the individual process past experiences and minimize their triggering influence. Group therapy, through anonymous fellowships or clinical settings, provides essential social support, shared experience, and critical accountability. And often, couples therapy is necessary to repair the broken communication and restore the fundamental trust within the primary relationship.
And sometimes the biology needs to be addressed directly to help the psychological work.
Absolutely. If the impulse control is overwhelming, or if co-occurring mental health disorders are driving the addiction, pharmacological intervention may be necessary. This can involve specific antidepressants to aid impulse control and regulate mood, or, in certain severe situations, hormonal treatments designed to dampen an overwhelming, biologically driven sexual drive. That allows the psychological therapies to gain a foothold.
The first step is always the highest hurdle. What are the essential actions a listener should take if they're recognizing these patterns in their own life?
The immediate priority must be seeking professional assessment and breaking the secrecy. Consult a specialized physician, psychiatrist, or psychotherapist for a professional diagnosis and a personalized treatment plan tailored to their specific situation. Concurrently, immediately seeking out peer support groups is invaluable for gaining connection, sharing the burden, and dismantling the isolation that fuels the entire addictive process.
We have to dedicate time to those standing in the fallout. The enormous impact this behavior has on partners and family members is often a second, hidden crisis. They are, in a sense, often functioning as co-addicts.
The experience the partner is devastating. Partners are frequently compelled to cover up, excuse, minimize, or desperately try to control the affected individual's behavior. This role reversal, trying to manage the unmanageable, progresses through recognizable and painful phases.
What are those phases for the loved one?
The initial phase is the protector phase. The partner attempts to cover up the behavior, rationalize the addict's actions, and take on all of the addict's neglected responsibilities: financial, domestic, emotional. They desperately cling to the hope that their love or tolerance or management will somehow restore normality. When protection fails, this often shifts into the more desperate controller phase. The partner moves to active monitoring, checking phones, hiding money, demanding constant accountability. They might even engage in unwilling sexual activity with the addict in a misguided effort to retain control over the situation or fix the relationship. It's an exhausting and self-destructive phase.
And when exhaustion and repeated betrayal erode all hope.
That leads to the devastating accuser phase. This is marked by intense chronic anger, profound emotional withdrawal, and deep resentment. The partner is just overwhelmed by the emotional and physical toll of carrying the problem and can no longer sustain the facade of stability.
And the risk of co-addiction is that these well-intentioned attempts to help actually enable the cycle to continue.
That is the critical paradox. By covering up for the addict, the partner inadvertently enables the addiction by preventing the affected individual from facing the true, painful, real-world consequences of their own actions. If someone else is mitigating the chaos, the addict has far less incentive and less pain, driving them toward genuine, difficult change.
So what is the crucial guidance for partners who are struggling to maintain sanity right now?
The primary, most essential task for the partner is a shift in focus: radical acceptance. Accepting that they cannot force the affected individual to change, regardless of how much they love them. They must redirect her energy inward, prioritizing their own emotional, financial, and mental well-being and establishing firm, clear boundaries. They must allow the addict to assume full responsibility for their own life, their actions, and their own recovery journey. And support groups designed specifically for codependents are absolutely critical for partners to process their own trauma and grief and to learn the tools of self-care and non-enabling behavior.
The journey to recovery is ultimately dual then. The affected individual seeks freedom from the compulsion, and the partner seeks autonomy and healing for themselves. #tag ISX. Conclusion and final takeaway. We've covered immense, challenging territory today, from the diagnostic criteria that define the loss of control and the destructive consequences, to the deep roots in trauma, emotional dysregulation, and measurable neurobiology. This is a complex disorder involving powerful neurochemistry and, well, deeply flawed coping mechanisms.
But the central optimistic takeaway must be reiterated. Recovery is absolutely attainable, provided there is genuine motivation, coupled with sustained professional guidance and community support.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the capacity to recover from addiction, and the capacity to avoid falling into addictive patterns in the first place, it's fundamentally tied to a concept we should all actively cultivate: resilience.
Resilience is truly the psychological armor against life's inevitable blows. It's defined as the ability to recover from setbacks, conflicts, and crises without suffering long-lasting psychological impairment. Resilience acts as a powerful buffer against all forms of behavioral addictions, including sexual compulsion. Resilient people possess better internal tools, better weapons to handle chronic stress, profound disappointment, sadness, and sorrow without immediately needing an external replacement gratification or a quick, numbing escape. A strong inner life allows you to withstand the urge to anesthetize yourself. Resilience means accepting the painful reality of a situation, focusing energy on solutions rather than ruminating on problems, and having a realistic, grounded understanding of your own strengths and weaknesses. This capacity transforms crises from insurmountable obstacles into opportunities to learn, grow, and strengthen self-confidence and self-determination.
Which means the greatest tool for recovery isn't the sudden absence of desire or temptation, but the deep commitment to constructing a different, fuller, more emotionally honest life.
Absolutely. The decision to look forward, to embrace personal responsibility, and to tolerate the initial pain of recovery is the only force stronger than the immediate corrosive relief offered by compulsive behavior.
So here is the final provocative thought we want to leave you with. A truly resilient life, a strong life, is not built on the absence of problems or pain, but on the profound acceptance and the active, courageous management of those problems. The escape only delays the reckoning. Facing the crisis is what actually frees you.